All right. Good afternoon, business law students for summer two. And I hope everybody's doing great. This is going to be module one, lecture one. And I wanted to apologize for about my goal was to get this lecture up earlier, but I had some pretty exciting news. Go ahead and share it with y'all. So I'm actually leaving the DA's office and onboarding as a full-time faculty come this fall. Very excited, very privileged. I love teaching and I love being a DA. I've loved my career there, but this was a great opportunity. So I was having to wind some stuff up at work, and so naturally, there's kind of a cascading effect, you might say. But um, yeah, my last day at the DA's office was Friday, and I guess I should say yesterday. And so basically, um, yeah, I'll be pretty much focusing on getting ready for the new fall term. So anyway, wanted to share that with y'all, and we're going to be definitely ramping stuff up here as we sorry, I'm getting just closing out some windows. Um, but the lectures are going to come much quicker now, and I just want to explain kind of what the delay was in case you were wondering. But no worries, I'm going to get lectures up this weekend, and we're totally on track, and looking forward to a summer two term with y'all. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. And remember, if you, I hope you've watched my intro lecture and kind of have a good understanding of my approach to teaching and expectations for the class. So remember, when you look at this book, it can be pretty overwhelming, not because y'all aren't smart and talented, it's just because of the volume of material. And remember what I said in my intro. Um, Whenever you are trying to cover a lot of areas of law, it's a challenge. It's a challenge for the professor, it's a challenge for the student because many of these topics could be easily, at least at a minimum, a semester long course, or some of them a year or more. So, my approach since I've been teaching business law has been to select the topics I think are most important so that students have a good working knowledge at an overview, kind of like a flyover, if you will. And so, um, every topic I've selected is not by random. It's not filler. I don't believe in that. It's all going to revolve around uh, the law and how it impacts businesses in some way. So, what I usually do is I'll have a sort of a hypo business, and a lot of things will kind of, link back to that to kind of give y'all sort of an understanding of a real world business scenario in business law. All right. So without further ado, let's dive in. So chapter one is looking at the legal and constitutional foundations of business. And what I always tell my students is, to get a really good working roadmap of the law, everything legal is going to begin and end with the US Constitution. So, I don't know what everyone's experience with the Constitution is. Some people may have read the whole thing, some may have, you know, seen pieces of it, explored parts of it here and there in different courses. But the foundation of US law and government is the US Constitution. The US Constitution is not an overly long document, um, but it has the core of everything that our legal system and the way our government operates revolves around. And when I say it begins and ends with the Constitution, you can't have laws that are in violation of the Constitution. And if there's a question about it and a high court declares that something is unconstitutional, that law is void. That law or act, I should say, is void. And we're going to talk more about that in later in this module, but also in chapter two, um, which is also part of this module. Um, okay, so what do we know about the US Constitution? Well, a few things. First of all, kind of its architecture, its framework. The Constitution has articles and amendments. Articles are the front pieces of it, and amendments are everything that have been added on and incorporated after the fact. So, when we think about the amendments, there's not just a ton of them, but the first 10 amendments are arguably the most famous because those collectively are known as the Bill of Rights. And the articles of the Constitution, when you just look at a Constitution and you look at Articles 1, 2, and 3, the first three articles, those lay out the three branches of government. And the three branches of government, a little bit of giving y'all a little bit of government civics as well here. Article 1 is the legislative branch. Okay, so more commonly known as Congress. And the legislative branch, its primary function is to create law. We are not going to go into a lot of detail like I did with my federal government students, but just kind of put that out there that the legislative branch, i.e. Congress, i.e. the House of Representatives and the Senate, create law like a gigantic factory. Does that impact business? Yes. Article 2 deals with the executive branch. The executive branch has two primary functions that I'm going to mention. Number one is implementation of law. So when laws get passed or programs get created or abolished, whatever it may be, or you're deploying something into the world and having an impact businesses, society, people, etc., that's from the executive branch. Okay. And, as a side note, many of y'all, I'm sure, have been tracking since the beginning of the year the cuts to federal government and agencies and programs, etc. Many of those cuts are coming from the executive branch because the executive branch houses all of those programs and agencies, etc. The other piece of the executive branch is enforcement. So, if the Department of Justice is looking into a business, if the Environmental Protection Agency as an entity in government is investigating whether or not a business was in violation of environmental regulations or laws, that's enforcement actions are taken under the executive branch. And then the third branch, Article 3, is the court system. And one of the things I always draw students' attention to is if you look at Articles 1, 2, and 3, there's progressive decline in the amount of detail between Article 1 to Article 3. Article 3, many people have commented it almost, compared to the other articles, looks like throwaway. Did the framers not care about Article 3? Did they run out of ink for their quills? What's going on? No, you have to keep in mind that our society now, contemporary America in 2025, is much more centered around the court system than they were back in the 1700s. The Supreme Court, as we'll see, did not have the prominence that it does now. And so that's why when you look at the Constitution, it's not by accident that there's more detail given to the legislative branch, because that was the branch that the framers or the architects, however you want to think about it, were most focused on. So when we talk about the Constitution, I always keep in mind sort of its architecture, and it's kind of the beginning and end for law and government in the United States. Now, a few things about the Constitution that are really important for students to understand. Number one, when we look at the Constitution, there is a strong principle of what is known as separation of powers and checks and balances. Those two principles are sister provisions. They go together when you look at that as a concept when studying the Constitution. Now, what does it mean? Well, separation of powers is, I've actually just described it. The fact that the government is divided into three major branches, and the thought process is that they each have their own responsibility. One creates, one implements and enforces, and the judicial branch, what is this function? It's kind of twofold. One, it interprets the law, if there's questions, and it determines, I guess you could say three things. One, it interprets the law, it evaluates and assesses the validity of laws that are passed, and it resolves disputes. Businesses are constantly getting sued. Okay, you just can't avoid it. And one of the things that a lot of times businesses spend a lot of money and time and energy into is defending or bringing lawsuits in court. Meanwhile, while they're running a business, there's a whole aspect of lawsuits and litigation that may be happening. So, regardless of the size of your business, the complexity of it, what it involves, that's why I think this course is so important for students who are studying business, want to work in any kind of business or organization, want to start their own business. It really does give you a solid working understanding of the business landscape, and what are a lot of these issues that are permeating that dimension. Because a lot of people go into business and they don't really think about the extent to which laws impact their business, not just their customers, but their employees, their contracts, which will be the subject of module 2, contracts. They're like, well, I didn't really sign up to, I didn't really go into business to be an attorney. It doesn't matter. Businesses have to be mindful of litigation. They have to be mindful of the impact the laws are going to have on their, their operating platforms, or whatever the issues are. And so each of these branches does something different. That's separation of powers. The other part of that is what's called checks and balances, because the goal in the Constitution was that no single branch was to be more powerful than the others. So the idea of having the equivalent of circuit breakers embedded in the Constitution, that's a very, that was something that was very important to the framers. So when we talk about checks and balances, what are some examples? All right, well, Congress can pass a law, but the president could veto it. That's a solid check and balance. The president could potentially want something to happen, but Congress refuses to fund it. A law gets passed, or as has happened with the Trump administration, there's been a lot of what are called executive orders. And executive orders, talk about in a minute, but when President Trump has signed a lot of executive orders, the lawsuits have begun. And many of his executive orders are still caught up in federal court, where that's another example of a check and balance. So when you look at how each branch is able to check or keep the others from becoming overly dominant, that's called checks and balances. And that's very, very, very important to know. So let's kind of expand on that while we're on the topic, because this, you get sort of a front row seat to a lot of these concepts in real time, given how active the Trump administration has been with trying to get laws passed and trying to get executive orders. So what's the difference between laws and executive orders? Well, laws are a product of Congress. There's what I always tell my government students is, if you think about a law as basically a solution to certain problems, but it took a long time to get there. The bills, when they're introduced, have to go through quite a process. We're not going to cover that in this class, but it's an extensive process where it requires lots of steps, goes through the House of Representatives, goes through the Senate, so collectively Congress, then goes to the president for approval. So a law is, it's kind of like when you're a college student. There's a lot of courses you have to take, a lot of steps along the way. And as a student, you would be a bill. You're a proposed graduate, if you will. And then if you graduate and now you're a graduate and you have your diploma, you'd be a law. And so that, very few bills in the legislative cycle actually become laws. Very few graduate, in other words. Executive orders are something that the president does independently. So, when President Trump took office and had certain agenda items that he wanted to see, he started from day one in the Oval Office signing what are called executive orders. Executive orders do not go through Congress. They are directives by the president to do something or not do something. And they are more expeditious in terms of deploying into the real world, but they still can be challenged legally, just like laws. So the judicial branch it can be a very powerful check and balance. And so, we're in July. You wouldn't have to Google much to see, if you Google, for example, Trump administration executive orders, legal challenges, you'll get a ton of articles. If you're just kind of curious to see what that looks like in real time. And businesses always are interested in what's happening with Congress, what the president's doing or signing, and court decisions, because I always keep in mind that there are different dimensions to business law in the real world. There's laws that could impact your customers. There's laws that impact requirements on you as a business owner, whether it's environmental, cybersecurity, regulations, whatever it may be, taxes. And then there's laws that impact you and your employees. Okay. And as a business owner or business employee, you're going to be interested in that. And then there's these laws that may not be impacting your business specifically, but a really good example right now has been the whole tariffs that the White House has been very committed to on a certain level. And there's been a lot of articles and discussions about how tariffs are impacting businesses and which businesses are being most impacted, how businesses are compensating for tariffs. So, in terms of real world applicability, I think that this is an excellent time to be taking this course. And so, it'll, at the very least, it's going to give y'all a great perspective and a little bit more understanding into what you're seeing when all of these pieces are in play with actions, reactions, consequences, etc. Okay. All right. So in addition to separation of powers and checks and balances, there's another concept that I always want students to know, because I think it's really, really, really important in the world of business, and that's federalism. Federalism is a concept that deals with the power balance between federal and state government. So this concept, both as an idea and as a practical reality, goes back to the earliest days of our Constitution. And when I make statements like that, I'm not just making those statements. If at all possible, I'm always going to tell students why. I'm a really big believer that it's not just about memorizing a concept and just accepting it. I always try to tell students what is the background to it and from where you can locate it. So for our purposes in federalism, okay, I've given you a definition of it. It's a power balance between the federal and state government. How do we know it exists? Let's go back to the Constitution. So we go to the Constitution and we're going to go to Article 6, not Amendment 6, but Article 6. Okay, so the first part of the Constitution. Article 6 has a clause in it known as the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause essentially states that federal law in the Constitution outranks state law. Okay, it's a notion that is very similar to, for example, if you're a teenager living in your family's home and you have a lot of freedom and flexibility. Okay, let's say in this hypothetical, but at the end of the day, the house rules govern. And sometimes in movies and TV shows and even real life, you might have heard that famous phrase uttered by parents or guardians that because I said so, or my house, my rules, or some variant of that. When you see that, can it cause tension and conflict? Yes. Is it always agreed upon? No, definitely not. Even in the best of relationships. So in federalism, the framers made it clear that in Article 6, there's something called the Supremacy Clause, that federal law and the Constitution outrank the state. Is there a counterweight to that? Yes, there is. For that, we would go to the end of the Bill of Rights, i.e. the first 10 amendments, to Amendment 10. In Amendment 10, there's the concept of reserve powers, meaning there's lots of powers, duties, and responsibilities that are kept with the states. And so what ends up happening is that states want as much power and freedom as they can get. And so if the federal government does something that it doesn't like or passes a law, they try to challenge it and saying, you shouldn't be able to do that because we have the 10th Amendment reserve powers. And the federal government often says, no, it doesn't count, or that's not how it is supposed to work. And so you end up potentially having legal conflicts. So federalism is alive and well. There's always and has been and always will be conflict between the federal governments and the states. The other thing about federalism I always like to remind students is there a practical example, even more so, that I can give? Absolutely. Grant money. In the world of grants are packages of money that are given for certain purposes, and they come in different shapes and sizes. And so when you see the federal government giving, I'm just going to use an example, $500 million for small businesses, or something like that. That's federal dollars that are packaged up to use for a generalized purpose or very specific purpose, be that, depending on what it is. So when you look at the federal government and its relationships with the states, you always have to be mindful of what the federal government is doing and how the states are they in line with that? Is there a lot of conflict with the federal government or not so much? If the current White House administration is more aligned a certain way with how a certain state government is, what does that relationship look like, et cetera? So one thing to keep in mind too is that Texas prides itself on being a very quote unquote business friendly state, meaning it likes to attract businesses to the Lone Star State and grant them a lot of freedom and flexibility. And so, for example, in the past, when the administration in Washington was not really aligned with Texas politics, you saw a lot more tension and conflict. When the environment in Washington is more aligned with Texas, then you see a different environment. But from a state perspective, Texas tends to be very states friendly and business friendly on purpose, so they can attract businesses here, gain tax revenue, etc. So when you look at federalism and the relationship between national and state governments, that's important for businesses as well. And a final concept I want y'all to be aware of is what's called judicial review. Remember I said that in the early days of the Constitution, the court system, the judicial branch, wasn't really given as much power and deference as we give it today in contemporary society. That's not by accident. That's just how society was then. In the early 1800s, there was a case that went before the Supreme Court that changed everything in this regard. The case was Marbury versus Madison. And I won't bore you with the facts. The facts really aren't that interesting. You're not missing anything. But what came out of that case was the ability of the U.S. Supreme Court to declare an act or a law unconstitutional. Okay, meaning the Supreme Court could say that. Article 3 doesn't give them that power. It's Marbury versus Madison that gave them that power. And a lot of commentators have said that at the time, it didn't really register to many people what was happening or the transformative nature of it. But the Chief Justice at the time knew what he was doing. Absolutely. He was a very brilliant legal scholar and jurist and did this on purpose. So the Supreme Court's power in today's environment really owes itself a lot to Marbury versus Madison, the ability of the court to declare an act or law unconstitutional. And that's pretty powerful. If you think about the power of the president or the power of Congress, and the court is able to declare that what they did is in violation of the Constitution, therefore not valid, that's pretty something. Okay. Now, let's see. One other thing that I want to cover, a couple of things I want to cover actually, is that when we look at the different types of laws, okay, when someone, I'll back it up even more than that. If you've ever met or know any lawyers, okay, oftentimes one of the questions people ask them is, what type of law do you practice? Because everybody has sort of an idea of, some people I've met think lawyers do everything, and that's no more true than if you ask a doctor, do you know everything about every element of medicine? I doubt that. We live in an era of specialization. And when you think about the legal system, and in the areas of law, there's two main branches of law. The first is what is called civil law. And when you think about civil law, those are the kind of cases where often one company is suing another, a customer or customers is suing a company, employees are suing the company, a company is suing an employee, contract disputes, often what's at stake, not always, and I'm overgeneralizing a little bit, but often what's at stake is money. And often it's private parties going against each other, but not always. It could be government against companies or companies against government, but often what's at stake is money. Now, if you are in the realm of criminal law, that means that there are allegations of violations of that a crime has been committed. Whether individuals are doing it, a company's done it, and there's no shortage of cases on both sides of the aisle. And one of the things I always want students to kind of be thinking about, because this will play into your written assignment for the course, is when you see articles and a business or a business owner is accused or being investigated for something, what is the nature of the legal case? Is it civil or is it criminal? Or is it both? Is it possible to have both? It absolutely is. For example, I'll just make up an example. If a manufacturing company was caught dumping radioactive material into a water source, okay, and a number of people got sick and there were fatalities, do you think there'd be lawsuits? Absolutely. There'd be a ton of civil lawsuits for money and damages. We'll talk about that in later on. But there could be some criminal dimensions to that. Knowingly dumping dangerous toxins into a waterway, I guarantee you there's going to be some potential criminal indictments and potentially people going to prison for that. Not every case that is civil is going to have a criminal component. Not every case that's criminal is going to have a civil component. But I want you to have an appreciation for that's often a crossover. So often too, if there's criminal actions, civil lawsuits may not be too far behind, from victims, families, etc. So just kind of keep that in mind. Another concept that I kind of want y'all to be mindful of is that often agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, they police areas in a concept known as regulation. Regulation or regulatory practice, however you want to think about it, anytime you hear that word, I want you to think those are rules imposed by government designed to structure, police, and control certain areas of our society. So a lot of businesses spend a lot of time dealing with regulatory agencies and making sure they're in compliance. So the more complex the business is or the larger it is, they have entire divisions that deal with regulatory compliance. I had classmates when I was in law school that ended up in corporate law just pure corporate law and did regulatory compliance, where they would track regulations that came down and make sure that the business was aware of it. So, for instance, I'll give you, real world example. If you worked at a manufacturing company and the company had smokestacks and it emitted certain you know byproducts into the environment. Well, the Environmental Protection Agency is likely going to set limits onto what can go into the environment, how much, what your factories have to do to reduce emissions, et cetera. That's called regulations. And so the regulatory compliance officers and regulatory lawyers, whatever they call them in that specific company, work together to make sure that the company is not going to run afoul of these regulations and potentially get into problems. Because if they get into problems, they can end up having not a number of different consequences, including bad press. They could lose customers. They could be fined. Their stocks may drop, and it's a cascading effect. So businesses try to avoid that type of running into being out of compliance with these regulations. So agencies make these regulations, and they're a form of what I would call mini, MINI laws. Okay, they didn't specifically come from Congress, but Congress grants the power to these agencies to make these rules, and these rules have the force of law. Okay, you can't. I mean, you can't use the argument. Well, strike that. You can make an argument. Okay, never mind. Too complicated. Not going to go into it. But basically, what I want y'all to take from it is, if a regulatory agency has the power to do this from Congress, and they employ these rules, the companies are supposed to follow them. And it can be very impactful in a negative way when they don't. All right. So one concept or power that I do want y'all to be mindful of is when we say that Congress has the power to do this or Congress has the power to do that. Where does one look to find powers of Congress? Good question. So we are going to go to Article 1 that outlines Congress and look at Section 8. Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 has the powers and duties that are given to Congress. And there's different types of powers. When you look and you see powers outlined specifically, that is called expressed or enumerated powers. So, for instance, imposing taxes, declaring war, coining money. These are all expressed enumerated powers that are given to Congress. Another one that is extremely important for business is called the Commerce Clause. So under Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power to regulate commerce. Now, one thing you will note about the Constitution, it is often vague. It's not like, a cookbook that has every single detail to make a recipe. It doesn't have, for example, see this. It's not built like that. So when the framers put in regulating commerce, or if I was to ask a student, what does that mean to you? All kinds of things are probably going to pop up. To some, it doesn't really seem that big a deal or even that important. But is it? It is. The Commerce Clause has really been used to expand the power of Congress to control and regulate businesses. Because, for many people, the idea of commerce and business, they're interchangeable. And so it is not unlimited, it is not infinite, but it's pretty expansive. So businesses are often regulated by Congress through the use of the Commerce Clause. So the powers that are listed in Article 1, Section 8, if they're expressly there, are called express or enumerated. And then the final part of that is what is called the implied powers. And that comes from the very last piece of Article 1, Section 8, where it says, Congress shall have power, ... necessary and proper. So the necessary and proper clause. And that basically expanded Congress's ability to deploy laws even if they're not expressly listed. So greatly expanding congressional power. But I did want y'all to know kind of where one looked for that type of authority. Okay. That is pretty much all I wanted to cover for chapter 1. There's even though it may feel like a lot of information, there's actually more concepts, but we're not going to cover those. I picked the ones that I thought were most important and that I wanted y'all to know. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap up this lecture. And the next one we're going to be looking at is going to be the court system. And we're going to be looking at how cases, how the court system is set up, what that means for businesses, how it operates, and then, kind of how cases are going to flow with a lawsuit and litigation. All right, y'all. So without further ado, I will close this out, get it posted, and then I'll be rolling into the next lecture in a little bit and get that posted, and we will be totally on track, for this week. All right. I'll talk to you soon. Take care, y'all.